and founder of Something or Other Publishing, Wade Franson, is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society, from messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted through our culture. Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Tonight's episode, The Separation of Church and State, with Cameron Cowan.
Good evening, everyone. We're sorry to be running a little bit late. I had the internet in my house go down right before we were going live. Had to reboot my modem. I'm sure none of you have ever experienced that. But here we are with Cameron. And we've had Cameron on the show before some time ago. And I'd like to welcome you back, Cameron.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And looking forward to this discussion. I know we have talked back and forth about it a little bit, so I'm excited to see where it all leads.
Well, I'd like to start by introducing you to our audience. You are the author of a number of books, and you are the host of a podcast, or do you call it a podcast, a show called the Cameron Journal, among other things.
Well, the Cameron Journal is a written publication. It is also a podcast. It is also a YouTube channel. In the grand tradition of how I have always done that. So, if you want to go listen to my latest author interview, CameronJournal.com/podcast, and the weekly news hour will be coming back in the new year. So.
And what is the primary focus of the Cameron Journal?
It really is research, insights, and an exploration of culture. So I gather the best of the internet together under one roof. I write about different subjects, and we just kind of explore the world together. I do deep dives and long-form journalism as my primary sort of creative expression. In fact, this year we're launching Cameron Journal Plus, which is my new membership program to support that long-form journalism, because it is very intense and very expensive to do without some support. So, so that's kind of what the Cameron Journal is all about. And sometimes I'm writing about stuff. Sometimes I'm doing a video about something. Sometimes I'm, interviewing somebody. So it's really fun to sit down with different authors and learn about them, their life, their experiences, and see, what they've been up to and where they've gone and the things that they've seen.
And you have a particular lens through which you address many of these issues, I assume, that may have to do with your particular upbringing. When we had you on the show last time, if I recall, you've written and talked a little bit about your upbringing in a more conservative religious milieu, if I may say
Yes.
so,
Yep.
and your challenges in finding your own way from within that somewhat, restrictive path. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I would say that's pretty spot on. I try not to tell people what to think about a lot of stuff. I'd probably make more money if I did. But I try to kind of present stuff to people and say, here's what I do know. Here's what I don't know. Here's what I can tell you with certainty. Here's what I can't tell you with certainty. Draw your own conclusions from there. So I would like to engage people's thought processes and thinking about this stuff, and get them sort of thinking about these issues and bringing their own selves to it, so that they're not just spouting latest talking point, they've actually given some thought to it.
Right. And I think this year, it is a new year in the Gregorian calendar. So happy New Year to you and everyone. This year on the Created in the Image of God show, we're going to do a little bit of a shift. Some of our longtime viewers might have noticed that we have a slightly different intro. Dan Sanderson will be here occasionally, but he will not be able to co-host the show with us this year. We'll be introducing some faces you've seen, some faces you haven't seen as the months roll by over the course of the year. But our focus will be more directly into that religious space. But nonetheless, the ethos, the mantra that I've tried to develop over the last year or two will continue, which is that religion must inspire, not coerce. What we're going to be doing a little bit more of in this year's shows are looking at people's origin stories. So, for example, yours, Cameron, we'll dive into it here in a moment. But with a little bit more focus on the coming of age, the establishment of one's own point of view, you might say, one's own Weltanschauung, the lenses through which we look at reality and through which we try to discern or distinguish truth from error. Each one of us may have our own unique way of doing so. In my travels around the world, having lived in multiple countries, and I've shared in the past, the great epiphany that I had sounds very simple, but it's actually quite profound. Everybody thinks they're right. Everybody thinks they're right because why else would they think what they think? People don't go around thinking I'm right. I'm wrong in this idea that I have. It's wrong, and therefore I'm going to pursue this idea that's wrong. People pursue their ideas, try to live from within their ideas, their ethos, their creed, their philosophy, their ideology, because they believe in it and they think it's right. But why do we think it's right? And where does that discernment come from? And how did we arrive at that? And are we willing to take another look at it if we're challenged by the facts or another way reality of some kind? So, Cameron, let's dive into that with you a little bit. Going back into that ground we talked about when you hear the first time, but with a little bit more focus on the coming of age. So rehash, share again for our audience where you came from, your parents, where you were born, what you were born into, and then how you grew up as a young lad and then teenager.
Yeah, so I was born in Denver, Colorado, in the city and county of, so I'm actually a native Coloradoan, native Denverite. Won't find too many of those running around. And I was I was kind of the product of a very short relationship between my mother and my father. I wouldn't actually meet my father till I was 23 years old. Which was a very interesting experience, and gave me a sense of connection and place and rootedness that I didn't even realize I was missing. We'll circle back to him. And when I was very young, my mom married a very nice gentleman. And they got married when I was 5 years old, and we moved to a very nice sort of bucolic suburb, and started going to school. My stepdad, that is, did not grow up with any sort of religion. My mother didn't really either. But as we transitioned out of the private school system and into the homeschooling world, my mother thought church would be a good way to add in a new element of socialization, as well as the homeschooling community tended to be very Christian, particularly fundamentalist Baptist in our area. And so that's where
And was that in Colorado?
yeah, we're still in Colorado. I spent my summers in Northwest Arkansas with my grandma, so I believe I kind of grew up in both because I spent like half the year in Colorado, like the other half of the year in Arkansas, where we also went to church, New Hope Baptist Church, which is a Free Will Baptist church, and so that was kind of how I grew up, and I stayed in that world of homeschool fundamentalist Baptist Christianity until I was 18. And then I went to one of the most conservative colleges in America, Pensacola Christian College in North Florida, and I lasted about a month there. And I was already struggling with my sense of self, particularly around my sexuality, all this type of thing. And so when they found out I wasn't maybe quite as heterosexual as they thought I should be, I was quickly gotten rid of. And on the very long, sad, lonely drive from Pensacola all the way back to Colorado, I that began my departure from that world. It kind of just broke the glass open, and then I began exploring other ideas, other faiths, other things. 5 months later, I went to a public college. I walked onto campus wearing leather shoes, long slacks, um, a cardigan very similar to this one, um, and a collared shirt. And people asked if I worked there. I saw people with skateboards and long hair, which was just like of the sinful and awful people you didn't want to associate yourself with, um, all this type of thing. So it was a whole new world, and I just kind of kept exploring all sorts of things, people, new thoughts, new ideas. I told people, I said I did all the drugs, I drank all the things, um, I had all the fun one could imagine. Still did my undergrad degree in 2.5 years, so um, and and went from there. I When I was in Florida, I was in the music program, left that, switched over to political science, did that in undergrad and grad school, and then this time last year, I graduated with my MFA in creative writing from Goddard College. Um, but yeah, so it was kind of a slow kind of breaking out and away. And after grad school, I got back into theater again. I got into nightlife, which was a whole new experience of all sorts of things. Um, but I kept up in exploring different spiritual practices, mostly to kind of fix myself. I wanted to fix whatever was wrong or going on in here because I didn't get a lot of stuff. I didn't understand a lot of stuff. Um, I didn't necessarily. Um, People have never liked me that much. Um, and I was always trying to figure out kind of what that was about that. Um, and I did 10 years of therapy and years of spiritual practice, and I've gotten to meditate with some really great people like RJ Stewart. I've gotten to work with I actually worked for him for 5 years, as well as did spiritual practice with him. Um, I got to work with Don Oscar, who's a very popular Peruvian shaman, who does trips where you do ayahuasca and all this type of thing. I got to work with him at Shambhala in Boulder, Colorado. Um, so I've gotten to, be in the presence of the best in the business. And and it was all very enlightening and very exciting and very interesting. And I had a lot of great experiences. I met amazing people. I explored Sufism for a while when I lived in Seattle. Um, just really great stuff, really great people, really great things. Um, and I never found my home, spiritually speaking. Um, RJ Stewart's work in Western Esoterica came the closest, but I haven't been super involved in that world in several years now. Sufism wasn't a thing. The Peruvian shamanism was never really my thing. Um, I've never really found a solid, home of faith. I have my own private beliefs. I have my own private thoughts on things. I have my own philosophy about life in the world. I'm very open. I'm very egalitarian, um, which is not terribly popular these days. But that's kind of where I'm at, and kind of where I live. And so it's been an interesting ride to grow up in a world that was so sheltered and so cloistered into a world that was so much more expansive. I have a lot of friends, including people I've dated, that are just kind of like, they don't understand how one can live like that. And I have friends who grew up in that world, and we talk about it, and it's like, yeah, that's the way it was, sort of thing. It's very hard for people to understand it if you kind of didn't grow up in it.
And you're talking now about the more conservative Baptist part of it, or are
Yes.
you talking about the more expansive,
No,
explore everything?
if you didn't grow up, particularly the combination of fundamentalist Baptist homeschooled, that's a very particular type of sheltered that most people don't understand. Even Baptist Christian school, because I also attended a Christian school in high school, is honestly more open than how kind of shut down the homeschooled world was. Um, and that also extended into my politics. I grew up as a Republican. I was state treasurer of the Colorado Young Republicans. I was chapter president for 2 years. I was a national delegate 2009. I attended Teen Pact, which is pretty much the breeding ground for tomorrow's young conservative minds. I ran a Tea Party publication. I probably am the only person in America who was involved at a deep level in both the Tea Party and the Occupy movement back to back. And the Occupy movement was the start of my political liberalism. In fact, I'll be giving a TED talk in April in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I talk about this and I talk about individual collectivism, which I've talked about on the show. Go watch. It's in the Go watch. And when after this is over, go watch that. And so that was, seeing how the system didn't work for people was the beginning of my political liberalism. But that came late for me. That wasn't till 2011. I'd already gone through 2 degrees before I started to really soften up, as it were. So that's kind of how it happened and kind of how I got to here. I've lived all over. I've traveled all over. I've been to every corner of this country that's possible to go to. I've been to a great deal of interesting places on the planet as well. And I've gotten to write about it and take people along with me on the Cameron Journal. There's a couple great films. I did a writer residency in Canada in the winter when it was negative 29 degrees. And it's on the YouTube channel. You can go watch that. I did an album for a street performer busker of mine called Heart Close that was really cool. So I've lived this really random life, unfortunately.
Well, yeah. So I'd like to wrap up this segment by asking the question a little bit more pointedly. As you've gone, and exploring all these different, going from ultra conservative, sheltered, closed in, as you've described it, to exploring, a lot of different approaches to life, many of which did not resonate with you, 1 or 2 which resonated a bit more. How have you personally sifted through that? How do you personally determine which pieces you wish to hold on to? Because as you go through those various groups, there are adherents, right, who sort of buy the whole package. Yeah. And I found it interesting that you commented earlier on having worked with the best in the business, because we don't think of spirituality as a business unless we're somewhat cynical and skeptical, right?
Then it is a business. Right. Having worked on the business side, it is a business, but that's another topic for another day. Yeah, I'm not wanting to go down that rat hole. I'm just saying, so how do you sift through then? Or how have you sifted through to determine what to retain and what to toss out? I have been blessed, some would say cursed, with, from a very young age, knowing exactly who I was. And I know almost immediately if something is for me, and what I'm willing to tolerate. I have that sort of, I describe it as like an inner kind of bar of steel that runs like from my throat down to my pelvis, where that you can hurt the rest of me. And I think that comes from growing up in an abusive household, where physical violence was a part of the conversation. But I always have that untouchable core. And so for me, I always looked at if I was going to accept something spiritual, something from beyond our standard perception into my life, it had to resonate with that inner core at a very fundamental level. And if it didn't, out it went. That's the very short answer to that. So you described that inner core in very physical, earthy terms, almost as if you were a German. The Germans, in my experience there for 10 years, tend to, here in English, we say, what's bugging you? In German, the phrase is, what lice are crawling across your liver, right? A very literal visual of what's bugging you. They're literally lice crawling across your liver if you're being bugged. But you use that terminology rather than the more standard soul, right? It resonated with my soul or my spirit
or my inner being, or maybe even identity. I don't know. But why is that? Why would you choose those terms rather than, maybe the term soul? Is that
Well,
part of your
I
belief
think
or
it's
just your way of
more.
expression?
I think it's more evocative. I mean, I'm a writer. I write fiction, so I like terms that it immediately evokes an image in the mind of the listener.
Yep.
Instantly, I worked for a German master mechanic for 3 years, so I'm very well aware of their very odd sense of how they state things in that culture. Oh boy, and um, and so it is a very evocative. I feel like we throw around these terms, don't we? Soul body, light body. We throw around these terms very willy nilly with not necessarily understanding how those things are talked about even in the modern versions of the religions they come from. Like, we talk about these things, they come from Hinduism and Buddhism primarily. Although I think also a bit from the Baha'i faith. But they've become so broad as to be ineffective. So when I talk about it in terms of myself, I want an image that immediately evokes something in the mind of the listener. So that's why I chose that language, is because it gives people an immediate sort of idea without having to have it blended through whatever those overused terms might mean to them.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We tend to be glib and flippant in our use of language. We tend to use a lot of in-speak. And one of the tenets of this show is to independently investigate the truth. When you do so, you have to investigate those terms that you tend to have accepted maybe from somebody else's conception. One Joseph Atman comes to mind, who has the book. I used to have a copy of it right here, and now I'm drawing a brain freeze on the name, The Philosophical War, I think it's called, where he talks about how the concepts that we have aggregated are in fact the corruption of our mental model and our entire view and perception of the world. So I'd like to now go to our first commercial break, which is in fact a small short video of one of your books. And that gives us the opportunity to encourage the audience to participate in the chat. Again, sorry, we got a little bit of a late start. Some of the audience is still maybe coming back to check to see if we're here tonight. But please do put your comments in the chat. By the end of the show, we will be looking at those comments and having Cameron pick one to determine who should receive a copy of said book, which we are about to show the video of right now. Don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. When we come back, we'll dive into the main topic, separation of church and state, the founding of our nation, and how we as a people have meandered over the decades and even centuries now since this nation was founded. We'll be right back.
In the quiet moments of an ordinary day, Randy Carruth's life takes an unexpected and perilous turn. Cast Iron invites you to join Randy on a roller coaster of emotions as he unravels the mysteries hidden within his seemingly normal family. A stepfather with a dark secret, a sister in peril, Randy's journey unfolds into a suspenseful tale of survival and redemption. Faced with betrayal, Randy's choices lead him down a path he never imagined, navigating through the complexities of the prison system. Can Randy find forgiveness for those who shattered his world? Will he break free from the chains that bind him? Cast Iron promises a gripping narrative of resilience and forgiveness. Available now at Amazon.
And in case you missed it, Cast Iron was authored by one Cameron Cowan, and you can win a copy of it by putting your comments in the chat. In case you're not interested in doing that, there's the QR code. You can go order it online right now, or at least bookmark it for later. So Cameron, before we went to that little break about your show, we were just exploring the lens through which you use to discern and distinguish truth and error, to decide what to keep and what to toss. It sounded to me like it was also very individualistic. In other words, you're not seeking to find or express a universal method, truth, path, and then tell everybody that they should follow it. Is that accurate, but rather you're looking at what works for Cameron. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I don't tell people what to do in the area where I hold degrees and expertise, so Lord knows I would not do it in the spiritual realm. Um, and my spiritual life has been, I mean, probably until I started doing this show, something I never really talked about in public. You know, it was something I did privately on nights and weekends, sort of on my own, and I didn't really tell anybody about it. And it's like, oh yeah, I have a thing tonight, and blah, blah, you know, and I just would kind of keep it to myself. So yeah, it was more focused on what resonated for me, because what might not resonate for me might resonate fantastically for someone else. And I went with another member of my family to a lot of these things for years and years and years. Um, and and there were things for her that resonated fantastically well that did nothing for me. And there were things that really touched me and experiences I had that really got me that did nothing for her. So I think it's really up to each person to find what is particularly resonant for them. And I think even within organized religion, um, people do different jobs in a parish, in a church, in a community, because they feel like God has called them specifically to do that, or provide ministry in that way, or whatever have you. Um, there are some people that show up Christmas and Easter, if we're lucky. Um, I view all as if it is valid. You know,
Well, and that's a nice segue to the separation of church and state, the founding of this nation. Um, the Declaration of Independence kind of launched that with, um, the statement, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created equal," and then we enshrined freedom of religion in our Constitution. So um, let's start with that statement in the Declaration of Independence, and let's dive a little bit into history, and we'll also then explore, why you have an interest in civics. Maybe if we get to it by the end of the show, we'll talk a little bit about individual collectivism and how that plays out in the American world. But anyway, going back then to that statement, is it fair to say that because the men who were involved in the Declaration of Independence stated we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created equal, that to them it was self-evident that there was in fact a creator, that they had what we today would call religious views, whether they viewed them at the time as religious because they may have viewed themselves as standing apart from or outside of a specific religion, while holding the self-evident truth that there was a creator of all men, regardless of which religion they professed.
well, we know from the statements of some of the founding fathers that they certainly took a broad view of creator, religion, spiritual, all this type of thing. It was Jefferson who thought that the American experiment should, could, and would accommodate what they called at the time Mohammedans, which we would now call Muslim people. That was the 18th century term. In this country, you had open Protestant and Catholic worship as standard practice, even in colonial times. But I think it's important to put this in context. Before the two great Enlightenment republics, France and the United States, every country kingdom had a government mandated state religion paid for by tax dollars. Many European countries still do. Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, the United Kingdom, all still have state religion.
Well, and even in Germany, again, the time I spent there, you had
Yeah.
to opt out of money being collected for either the Protestant or Catholic Church from your paycheck.
Right. Yes. And right. It's, I mean, and that is, to this still this very, this very old idea. And even expanding out of Europe, the linkage between government and religion has been part and parcel. The ancient Egyptian pharaohs believed that they were gods, brought to earth. This was true of Persia and Babylon as well. There were, Chinese emperors that sought remedies for immortality, that they might rule the Middle Kingdom forever. In Japan, the emperor is a product of the goddess Amaterasu, who has herself birthed the entirety of the Japanese people as one giant family all together. This is how we have talked about, I mean, for Native Americans and pre-Columbian Mesoamerican peoples in this country, the earth, Pachamama, that's a Don Oscar term, was gods because they were reliant on the earth and things growing and things coming up, and you had this you had a duplicitous amount of sort of nature-based gods, even in Africa, with basic ancestor worship, animism, all this type of thing. There was no idea that these things should be at all separate. It was part and parcel of life. I read a great book last year called about the Hmong people immigrating to America, and it was called "And the Spirit Catches You and Then You Fall Down." Um, and it talked about how integrated religious and spiritual practice was in the life of the Hmong people that come from the mountains of Thailand and had been displaced by the Vietnam War, and they immigrated to California. And if you haven't read it, Anne Fadiman, go read it. It's fascinating. And So when you look at all these different ways to handle culture, it wasn't until the 18th century that we said, hey, you can govern a nation and go to church, and those things need not be tied together. And I found Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist pastors, where he said, believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions. I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole of the American people, which declared that their legislature should, quote, make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, unquote, thus building a wall of eternal separation between church and state.
So let's
that was brand new, never been done before.
Thank you.
And
there's your American exceptionalism right there, right?
Of how things interact with each other. It is a concept that is only really as old as this country, really.
Well, right there is your American exceptionalism.
Yes.
Right. So now, taking that statement, it would seem, based on that statement, that the idea behind the separation of church and state was to place limits on the state to interfere with religion. I mean, that's what was going on at the time, right? In other words, it was a given that people had deep religious beliefs. It was a given that
Absolutely.
Governments had used those religious beliefs to create unity and conformity and to achieve goals and ends and means in managing the people, governing the people.
Yeah.
But here it was stated that is not something that the government needs to do or in fact should be doing.
Yes. And that is very important. There was a day and time when if a pastor said something in the pulpit at church that the government did not approve of, that person could be arrested. The King James Bible was a government sanctioned document, hence the name.
Right.
So very different,
with particular emphasis on many things that supported the rights of kings.
Yes. And yes, and you also, until Charles II, you had this whole idea of the divine right of kings, and that monarchy is a calling from God, and that it is God's will that monarchs rule and people are their subjects. It's that it was considered the natural order of things, and that didn't break apart till Cromwell, which laid the foundation for a country like ours to exist. It
So,
was a
so,
very
so
kind of
then,
different idea.
then how did we arrive at today's version, where we've had the co-president on this show of the Freedom from Religion Society. I subscribe to Scientific American, and in every issue of Scientific American, they have an ad promoting the Freedom from Religion Society, in which
Yes.
it is their particular view that the path forward, for America is to abolish religion and to eliminate its influence, rather than to, in a sense, encourage the population to hold religious views and to practice them independently of their role in a government, um, and the government's rules over people.
Well, there's a couple. I mean, I don't go that far, but there's a couple reasons for that. One, high amounts of religious belief is correlated with lower national wealth. There's one exception to that, and that's the United States of America. We are both highly religious and highly wealthy. That's unusual. Nowhere else on the planet
Well,
is
again,
that
there's the exceptionalism, because you know to me intuitively, I haven't done research on it, but this constrained uniformity ultimately stops the kind of innovation and creative destruction, that constantly makes things new. The Bible talks about things being made new again. Jesus said he would make things new again. But the role of religion, in terms of organized and practiced religion, which then becomes dogma, which is usually managed and controlled by priesthoods, but also by governments, as you've pointed out, restricts creativity, restricts innovation, restricts the free flow of commerce and goods. When I was a practicing minister, we had the particular religious views that that had us being completely separate from this world's social affairs, based on statements by Jesus, such as, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would fight." But he told Peter and his disciples to put away their swords, because my kingdom is not of this world. But he did predict a time when the kingdom of God would arrive on earth along with his second coming, right? So in that doctrinal framework, we believed we were preparing for the time when Jesus would return to build and he would establish, and we would help him build the kingdom of God on earth. And we would be kings and priests, and we would be given control over cities, as it's talked about in many of the parables. And we would help rule and administer the kingdom of God on earth. And it began, my own lens of filtering and discerning, distinguishing truth from error. I began to see that, me being a minister and my fellow ministers, I would not want to live in that person's kingdom, right? I began to see the traits and behaviors that were encouraged and adopted within our, little pyramid, and within our little social group, that, God forbid we would ever be given power and control, because it would not be pretty with the coercion that would then take place. And so, going back to American exceptionalism and your point about religion being a determinant of decreased prosperity, well, it makes sense in that context that, yes, America being the first time where you had this kind of a government that encouraged a diversity of religious views, that nation would outperform all its rivals. But in that sense, rivals. But is it fair to say that you could also go too far in that direction, and that if you start removing religious belief altogether, that's not necessarily going to lead to greater prosperity? There could be many evils and ills that could creep in if one believes that one, for example, that there's not an ultimate accountability, right? That there's not some higher power that is ultimately going to be ensuring justice.
But why does there have to be?
That's a great question.
I mean, because
I mean,
the reality is there's very little justice in the natural world. We have this constant chaotic competition of species and plants and things competing with no rhyme or reason, and stuff comes and goes without any sort of, mastery of it all, without no system that we have been able yet to discern of how it runs and how it goes, which I think is gorgeous and elegant. Scientists find it very frustrating. Mathematicians hate they can't define the world in math. I think that's the best thing about the world. You can't reduce it to a formula. Thank God. I would not want to live in a world that can be reduced to a formula. When it comes to religion and public life, for most of American history, religion was something that was privately held. It tended not to engage in politics a lot. This changes in the 1960s, with the advent of your Pat Robertsons and even Jim Bakers and people along those lines. And you have this sort of second great awakening that occurs in this sort of surge of religious fervor and feeling, but it's not just about your own internal spiritual life and how you choose to live yourself. It then also becomes this great political project in reaction to a lot of the changes that had happened in the 60s, particularly around things like abortion and no-fault divorce and segregation and all this type of thing. It kind of becomes this vast political project, which we're now beginning to see the tail end of, the last vestiges of. And I think it has really poisoned the well for a lot of people. I've sat in churches where no Bible was ever opened. The pastor was preaching from the newspaper, which in the churches I grew up in would be frowned upon. But it's I think one of the points that Jefferson was trying to make and other people have made and has kind of been standing in this country till the last 50 or so years is that religion, spiritual practice is between people and their God, however they choose to do that, believe in that, whatever have you, and that public life should be determined by ordinary, regular humans. Now, obviously, when you walk into a voting booth, you're bringing your religion with you. If you walk into a voting booth and you have deeply held Catholic beliefs that think abortion is wrong, you're probably going to vote for a person who is against that. I would argue that should not necessarily be up for public debate the way that it has been. Same thing with when we had laws outlawing miscegenation, marriage, and between Black people and white people, laws out, banning homosexual behavior, all this type of thing. These are not necessarily behaviors of adults that we should be regulating necessarily. But I think people should vote for the candidate who expresses their beliefs or not. And if you want to vote for the conservative, family values, heterodox candidate, then you should have the right to do so. If you want to vote for the person who's maybe more expansive, more egalitarian, then please do so. I wish we had more than 2 political parties in this country for exactly this reason. Because then we could have a Lib Dem, or a Christian Democrats like in Germany. We could have these kind of other mismatch of flavors that would better express the political will of the American people than it does, right now under our current system. But I do still feel very strongly one of the things
well,
that made
let
this
me
country
let me ask you a question, and
in religion, and now we do, and we're seeing the consequences of that.
let me ask you a question regarding that, because in theory, America does not have to be a 2-party system. Is that correct? I mean, Mr. Civics, in theory, could the Americans, right? The Americans, we could have 4 or 5 or 6. What does this say about the Americans?
Well, we have a structural problem. And it's one that we fixed in Germany and Japan. when you have a winner take all or a first past the post system where you have to get 50% plus one, it's very hard to have a multi-party democracy in that environment.
Are you talking about the president, or are you talking about? I mean,
No,
because the House of Representatives, even the
when you
Senate.
get down into congressional districts, it's still 50% plus one, which makes it very, if you have three political parties, it makes it very hard for anyone to get 50% plus one. And whichever two parties are the closest next election are going to want to get together, because then they can be guaranteed to win because they're going to have the majority of the votes. And so you have this natural collapse. When you have a winner take all system, you have a natural collapse with the two-party system. When you have a pluralistic system where you only need, in Germany, 33% of the vote to win, then you can have a three-way split and each party gets one seat, sort of thing. And you can then have, different ideas. The state of Washington does something really interesting. In its lower house of representatives, each house district has two seats. So you usually end up with a Republican and a Democrat, one of each. It makes the state legislature much more moderate than it would be otherwise. It gives Democrats out in Eastern Washington a chance to win. It gives Republicans in very liberal Western Washington a chance to be heard. More voices at the table. We should not have a two-party system in this country. We don't need to have one. We would have to fix how we vote, which some states are doing. Alaska has introduced ranked choice voting. I believe Vermont has as well, to start to begin to change how we vote so that we could actually have a true multi-party democracy. Because right now we're stuck in a binary.
Thank you for highlighting those things.
Yeah.
Right. So let me go to our next commercial break. We have one of our sponsors who has an app that can be downloaded on your phone. It's called Ocean 2.0 to take advantage of freedom of religion here in America. It features religious texts from all over the world in one easy place. Take a moment to watch this. When we come back, we'll have more with Cameron Cowan and the nature of the American exceptionalist system in which we have freedom of religion. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Discover the world's religious traditions like never before with Ocean 2.0 Reader. Our custom ebook reader is designed for exploration and study with an immersive audio integrated reading experience and powerful research tools available on all platforms including web, Windows, macOS, Linux, Android, and iOS. Experience the benefits of immersive reading by combining ear and eye with improved comprehension and vocabulary acquisition. Our interfaith library features books from various religions, so you can have access to a wealth of knowledge. Try Ocean 2.0 Reader today and elevate your reading experience.
And there's that QR code to download it. So we'll leave that up for a moment. We were just talking about the American system of having freedom of religion and what it's led to in a pluralistic society that has produced, some of the most innovative and unbelievable wealth the history of the world has ever seen. And Cameron was commenting earlier before the break about how this was exceptional in the fact that religion is usually a determinant of a lesser standard of living on a national level. Any other comments to wrap up that section, Cameron?
No. I mean, I think it's I think there's a lot to be. Well, I think it leads to a better society when we have a certain amount of separation between religious life and public life. It allows a wider variety of people to go and grow and thrive and do great things within society. And to some degree in America, we've kind of been able to have our cake and eat it too along the way. And if there's one thing I'm kind of sad about, is that there seems to be a very strong desire to bring that to an end. And I don't think that's a good thing.
Unpack that a little bit. Where Are you talking about the Freedom from Religion Society and their views, for example, or what else are you referring to in that regard?
Well, I'm mostly looking to two things. I'm in a world that is very dangerous. I'm looking to my right politically, and I'm seeing some very concerning anti-democratic sentiments. I'm looking to my left and seeing dogma the way I grew up with it, which isn't healthy, you know. Um a lot of kind of, I think, equally dangerous things. I mean, on the left, we have people being like, oh my God, it's immoral for a 28-year-old man to go out with a 19-year-old girl. It's like, at what point are we going to let women be adults? That's infantilizing. But you believe it so dogmatically, it's insane. Or if no men should ever hit on women, well, that's silly. Like, have you heard of flirtation? Do you want reproduction? Like, come on. And then over on the right, we have, yeah, like we have these very, I think, regressive ideas about religion and race and sexuality that are not in harmony with the society in which we live. And so I kind of look at it as both of these things are a problem, but I know where it's coming from. As I put up the camera, Joel, the world is complicated. This is not. The world is a complicated place. And history tells us that when the world gets weird, people cling onto naked dogma, values, fundamentalism, dry, easy, simple, cut and dry, do this, not that, all this type of thing, as a way to bring clarity to a complicated world. And unfortunately, I think that's probably the wave of the future, which is not great for people like me. It's very hard for people like me to live well in those types of societies. But that is kind of where we're at. And I think that's sad because we haven't really had to do that in this country before. And
so I think
going there at light speed.
well, there have been books written on things like white fragility.
Yes.
I think the pendulum has swung exceptionally strongly. It hasn't even so much been a pendulum swing; it's more like been wild, erratic swings in every direction. As we've had just rapid acceleration of change, spread of information, empowerment of technology. The internet age brought wealth creation on crack cocaine, whereas the robber barons were able to build infrastructure and get very wealthy that way. Here we had 20 somethings becoming billionaires because they'd invented essentially a widget that could be deployed on the internet and rapidly spread virally.
Billionaire because he wanted a faster way to meet girls.
Well, and yes, I was I'm refraining from going down a couple of rabbit holes that were sparked by what you were saying a few minutes ago. So as we bring this to a close, I want to once again point out the chat, and I'm actually going to share now another. Well, we'll skip that because we're coming to the end of the time. Another New Year's commitment for me is to keep the show closer to an hour. We will be going a little over time tonight because we started late. But what I've found is that oftentimes we're trying to give away books to the person who gave the greatest comment, and they're long gone by the time we finally get to the point of announcing their name because we've gone 30 minutes over time. So we're going to try to avoid that this year. That's a note to the audience as we move into it. Keep it a little bit crisper, a little bit tighter. So, does religion in the modern era, in the postmodern world, does religion help us work against fundamentalism? Which might seem like an odd question, because fundamentalism one typically thinks of as being a religious phenomenon.
Well, you can have fundamentalist movements within religious movements.
Well, yes, and you can have fundamentalist tendencies outside of religion. You mentioned certain political tendencies. I see, well, one of my favorite sort of jokes, sort of schoolboy pranks, is to highlight how the four horsemen of the apocalypse used to be the domain of fire and brimstone preachers who would talk about, the pestilence and the famine and the religious wars that would be fought by the various horses, the pale horse, the white horse, the red horse. But the proclamations about the four horsemen of the apocalypse and the horrors of the book of Revelation have become the domain of science, with climate change being one example and global pandemics being another example. In the void created by religious prophets who are, to your point, preaching from the newspaper, right? And talking about current events in apocalyptic terms. Well, we don't need them today because science is fulfilling that role on their behalf and prognosticating doom and gloom for humanity.
Yes.
Does religion help us against that kind of fundamentalism, where somebody has an ideology and believes that the world will be saved if everyone adopts it, and it's not coming from religion at all?
Well, you know this, and I've talked about this before, and it's in my first book. I am not on board with the climate change narrative. Haven't been for some time. So that one I'm always right at, because there's a lot of people saying a lot of deranged things that have no basis in any sort of scientific inquiry. So I mean, yes, I mean, I think religion can be a defense mechanism against that. Unfortunately, it's a rather poor one because it has too much baggage of its own, you know. And I think that makes things difficult for people as well. And I think but I think it can help people kind of break out of certain modes of thinking. I've always said of science, the problem with science and why it can't replace religion as much as Carl Sagan and others would like it to, is science doesn't know how to tell a good story. It's very good at defining our world. It does not know how to tell a story about it. And that's what people are looking for. They're looking for a story. They're looking for a narrative they can digest and understand.
That's
And
interesting.
in politics, you see this all the time. We are not based in facts. Haven't been for a decade. We're based on narrative. I teach this in marketing. When I teach this in business consulting, I talk about this in a wide variety of my work, which I always just used to quip, news is a narrative, so we call it a story. We live in narrative and story. That's it. That's all we have. It's so fundamentally human about us. And for a while, religion served that role. Now it's a little bit of religion. It's a little bit of science.
Well, and you mentioned Carl Sagan, right?
All of these things that create these narratives.
You mentioned Carl Sagan, and he certainly did that, and he did it well. But again, I'll reference in terms of the narrative, right, and the stories, and that's perhaps what he was onto that, and he was trying to accomplish that. But as a longtime subscriber of Scientific American, I would say, no, wait a minute. They constantly, and especially in the last decade, they have woven narrative into their articles. Almost every article tells a story, but it's interesting when you pointed this out.
It's a story.
No, wait. Let me finish. So what clicked when you told this is what they're doing is they're telling mini narratives that deconstruct the big story, right? They are deconstructing the big story. They are attacking the big broad narrative with a little mini narrative. And it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? And you have all these little mini stories about how this scientist or that scientist overturned. It's the big story there is Galileo, right? And the right. Copernican revolution, right? Which delivered a fatal blow to religion by showing that the Catholic Church was anti-science. I'm creating a narrative now. You know what I'm doing here, but the point is that's been going on ever since. The big narrative has been shredded with all these smaller narratives. So they do tell a good story, but it's a compact little story that's constantly hacking away at the big story. It's a
And it's not
deconstruction.
anything that you can believe in. It's not anything that
Right.
you can
Exactly.
hang your hat on when your child dies unexpectedly or your parents pass away. Science offers no, and this is where religion and spirituality is very good.
Right.
Science offers us nothing in the lowest, darkest times of our lives. They don't
Yeah.
have a story for that.
Well,
You
they
do
could.
not want to ask a medical doctor, well, what happens after we die? They don't know, nor do they care, because they can no longer charge the insurance company for that. So,
no, they want to keep you
yeah.
alive as long as possible, even in a vegetative state.
Of course, it pays better. Death is expensive. And so yeah, so you have these very difficult circumstances, and you have this sort of dearth, and that's why I think in this country you have declining rates of religious attendance, but the rate of people believing in God as a concept remains at 80%. People are like, and you'll see this even in people my age. I'm 30, almost 36 years old in 3 months. People will say, I believe in God, but I don't go to church. I'm not religious. Or they'll say, I'm very spiritual. I like to meditate. I read this person, all this type of thing, but they don't necessarily go to a building, all this type of thing.
Yeah.
It's it's a very different way of interacting with that than it has been in the past.
Well, and we're going to have to draw a line there and move to the chat. But for the audience, rest assured, we'll be exploring many of those topics as we move forward over the course of the year. What is the overarching narrative? What are the questions that many adherents of religion have failed to get answered because of the dogma, because of the calcification that entered into religion, because of the control of creative and honest readings of the actual texts that might have given answers had the answers that were provided by people who read those texts and interpreted them many decades or hundreds of years ago have not been looked at with a fresh eye. We'll be exploring all of those themes over the course of the year. But Cameron, let's go to the chat now. There have been a number of comments, interesting ones. If you want to peruse any of them that you want to highlight. While you're doing that, I'm going to highlight one here.
Baker has been doing yeoman's work, talking about all this stuff, which is really great.
I'd like to go ahead and answer Sarah's question while you review the chat, which is, hey,
yes.
Sarah, great question. When you popped in, we were discussing today the separation of church and state, the American experiment, how the American nation was exceptional in the fact that it allowed a plurality of religion, that it sought to remove the interference of the state from religious belief, allowing a proliferation of religious ideas and religions to grow within the country. Okay, you were mentioning Ralph. There have been a few others. Any particular comments you want to call out?
Yeah, so this one from Jet 4231 is really good. Some historic perspective, the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic reaction to it led to the death of large parts of some of the European countries. True, wars of religion, 120 years. Separation of church from state was a solution. It was. The wars of religion ended in 1646 by allowing all countries to freely choose their own religious practices, which was really important because that would no longer be controlled by a Lutheran synod or the Catholic Church. Countries were free to choose or not as they wanted to. It would be another 150 years where we would get separation of church and state, and a lot of the European powers have never separated church from state. That's still most of your crowned monarchs of Europe are also the heads of the churches of their countries. So the whole idea of not having a deep involvement between government and the church is a very American idea. It's a very Republican, small r Republican idea, and is really only present in a handful of countries.
So I'm going to throw out a word out. I know we have the Clearwater Baha'i channel here. This is an interesting thought that Cameron has just brought up for the Baha'is, and a little bit of in-speak here perhaps, but it's interesting to think of those monarchs as, holding on to that religion as part of the state, and the role of America in the evolution of society and religion. It's just something to think about. I just throw that out there. Other comments, Cameron? Did you want to?
Yeah,
Because
Lord
we're
Paul said that Christians should be subject to the higher powers, not to strive to become the higher powers themselves. That is true. That is very true. I believe that was in both Galatians and Second Corinthians. Paul advises that, and that's how it was in this country until the 70s. A lot of very religious people stayed out of politics. They didn't even vote because they believed politics was a dirty business that was not for good Christian people. And your Jerry Falwells and Pat Robertsons and Billy Grahams changed that, and it made it spiritual to go after, to conquer America for God, as Billy Graham would put it at one point, all this type of thing. And this idea that in order for this country to continue, we have to be based in good Christian values and all this type of thing is always struck me as so funny, because the founding fathers would be repulsed at the idea. They wanted Protestants, Catholics, anyone to be able to worship freely in this country without anyone saying, no, you can't do that, all this type of thing. So the idea that that's our modern political stance and all this type of thing is rather interesting. But if you look at it in the context of where we are historically and spiritually as a country, it makes a lot of sense. So those are my favorite comments out of the ones that I've read. But great discussion has gone on. And
well, sadly, I'm going to have to force you to do the 50+1% thing here and pick one, because we're going to be sending a copy of your book Cast Iron to one of these commenters.
Yeah, and I think it really should go to Ralph from Facebook. He's done a great job of just staying right along with us. So enjoy the book, Ralph. Give us a contact, and we'll get that out to you.
There's one of Ralph's comments for the audience, because I think depending on which channel you're tuning into, you're only seeing the YouTube or the Facebook. We stream out to multiple platforms, so you may not be seeing all the comments. I'm not really sure how that works live, but
no, that is true. Like when I usually watch this show when I'm not on it, I watch on YouTube. I can only see the YouTube discussion.
Yep.
I can't see Facebook or anything else. So it's nice when you post them on the screen, because I get to kind of see what other people are talking about and all this sort of thing. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. But yeah, Ralph's done really well, and we should definitely send him out a copy of the book. And it's a lot. It's quite a journey, but it's a lot of fun. So
well, there we go. I'm going to post that for Ralph. Send us your address to info@soupllc.com and give us your address, and we'll get that book to you. Cameron, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for being patient in the studio while I was rebooting my internet. And I'm glad we were able to talk about the separation of church and state. Next week, we have a woman from the other side of the pond, Lauren Roskilly. And I believe this will be a pre-recorded one, because it's middle of the night for her. She hails from Brighton Way in the southeast of England. Lauren is going to be talking about the subject of New Year's resolutions, but from a Christian perspective. She approaches the overcoming and healing of depression, anxiety, and self-harm from a Christian mind of Christ perspective. We'll be talking to Lauren about how to reconcile the seemingly disparate ideas around self-esteem, and Jesus saying that we should esteem others better than ourselves. And we'll be very much looking forward to Lauren's take on that. Next Tuesday, January 9th, same place, same time. And I'd like to announce in a couple of weeks, we'll be having a very special guest who many of you will know, maybe even have some of his books in your libraries. He's sold over 15 million of them. I'm not going to reveal his name just yet, but we've got quite a lineup for you, and very much looking forward to that. Lord Kai, still listening in, please send another email to info@soupllc.com related to the book that you won. It's quite possible that we got a little bogged down over the holidays. So I'll just show that in that. I guess it's good we didn't give Lord Kai a book. He's still waiting for the one that he got last time. But we'll definitely get that to you. Please send your comments, your questions to info@soupllc.com. And next week we'll be looking forward to seeing you back with Lauren from England. Cameron, any parting words of wisdom?
No, thank you everyone for listening in. I appreciate it. I'm so glad to be able to kick off the new year with you, Wade. How exciting, 2024. And we'll have known each other for almost a year, coming up here in a couple months, which is just so weird. The time has just disappeared. And so, yeah, there's a lot of interesting books about this, particularly a woman named Karen Armstrong has written about this stuff extensively. If you don't know Karen Armstrong's work, please go look her up. Great, excellent reading on this topic.
Thanks, Cameron. And thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week. Until then, may God be with you. Bye now.